The reform of state-owned enterprises has laid off tens of millions of people. He has worked for the country for most of his life, and kicked him away without giving him a penny. Those beneficiaries of the reform of state-owned enterprises have completed their business and received tens of millions of annual salaries. It's easy to manage if the business can't be done. Simply sell the land and build high-rise buildings on the ground. They posted it, and then became deputies to the National People's Congress, representing the people. Education reform, tuition fees are getting higher and higher, and the Minister of Education has changed, but the high tuition fees cost a lot. When I was in technical secondary school, in the 1980s, the state gave me 13 UN a month. Today's college students dare not imagine that at that time, a plate of roast beef with potatoes cost less than 20 cents, and ordinary dishes cost 2 cents and 3 cents, and a penny could buy a bowl of porridge. Everything is prepared in school, and I will go to college after wrapping up the quilt and buying a bowl. It's 13 UN a month, and I can't spend it all every month. Speaking of it, it makes people laugh and cry. Now, the university has become a money-making machine, a diploma wholesale department. Spend money not to learn things. The story of selling blood to go to college is constantly being reported in the newspapers. As for the medical reform, it costs 500 UN to see a cold in Beijing. One illness can knock down a middle-class family. In India, which is poorer than us, the best real estate is the hospital, which implements free treatment for all. And what about us? It is through these that the big money is generated. Housing reform, I was allocated welfare housing back then. I lived in 2 houses, and paid 50 cents a month for 1 room, and 1 UN for 2 rooms. After the housing reform, tens of thousands were paid. The most frightening thing is that in the past 8 years, house prices have increased by 5 or 6 times. People of my generation are relatively good. They have academic qualifications and jobs. Most of my classmates are dual employees. However, whoever has 2 boys in the family is considered fucking unlucky. Just buying 2 houses for the children in the county will cost 7 to 800,000. Think about it, if you are a salaryman, have no gray income, do not do business, and do not rob banks, where will the money go? Not to mention that both children have spent money on college. The repeated reforms have pushed the people into the abyss of misery. So, when the word reform is mentioned, people are so scared that they can't react for a long time. What are you going to do to me? A few days ago, I watched Lang Xianping's speech at Tsinghua University, reflecting on decades of reform and opening up. Mainly from an economic point of view. In fact, reforms cannot be achieved only from an economic point of view. Politics and economics are related, so there is political economy. Even though Lang Xianping and I were both called 9 Man of the Year by netizens, that was an exaltation to me, and I deserved it. Years ago, Beijing held a celebrity forum and asked me to participate to talk about economic issues, but I rejected it. I am not qualified. But regarding Lang Xianping's talk about reform, I think he missed the point and did not point out the real reasons for the problems in reform. I think, there must be problems in China's reforms, and it is not normal for there to be no problems. If there were problems in the previous reforms, there will definitely be problems in the future reforms. Why? Leading reformers, not the people. Only reforms that return power to the people are real reforms. If the government is not returned to the people, all reforms will turn into a bloody plunder of the people. We regard reform as crossing the river by feeling the stones. This touch can't be touched for 30 years, right? In the first 2 years, it was done by touch, so you can't touch it every day, right? No experience. Haven't figured out a routine? Guo Yiping crossed the river by feeling for the stones, and found a deep hole in the river, and almost drowned. If you Guo Erping cross the river again, you can't pay it back once, right? Guo Sanping, Guo Siping, feel it and stop it? Why? All the deep pits of failure have been discovered one by one, and the people after that can just wade through the water. The problem is not here. Problems in the reform are not caused by the level of the reformers, but by their positions. They did not stand on the standpoint of the people to reform. In terms of reform, the masses have no right to speak out, let alone lead the reform. Top-level designers design for the top, not for the masses. Reform requires no top-level design, but people's design. After 30 years of reform, all the problems that have arisen are essentially the result of power madness. Power is not restricted by the people, and the people have no right to speak or take the lead in reform. This is the fundamental problem that has caused problems in the 30-year reform. When talking about reform, we must also consider it from a political perspective. This is where I differ from what Lang Xianping said. As long as the government is not returned to the people, all reforms will strengthen the control of power over wealth, will make the gap between rich and poor worse, will intensify social conflicts, and will make life worse for the people until when internal and external troubles cannot support it, the heart will die and it will collapse. Only by returning power to the people can the long-term stability of the country be guaranteed. The 600 million internet users are the mainstream of Chinese thinking, and there is no future for relying on fooling the public. Some people say that reform requires the determination to cut a bloody road, and it requires the determination of a strong man to cut his wrists. I, Guo Yiping, want to say, reform does not need to fight a bloody road, nor does it need courage, nor does it need a strong man to cut his wrists. After all, corrupt elements and elements with vested interests are very few in China. There are more than 1 billion Chinese people, and they also have the artillery of the People's Liberation Army. What are you afraid of? Only reforms that are divorced from the people, only beastly privatization reforms, only reforms that are enemies of more than 1 billion Chinese people, and only roguelike beastly reforms need to kill a bloody road, right? If you want to reform for the sake of the 1.3 billion Chinese people, and the 1.3 billion Chinese people support it, why do you have to spend so much money? What else do you want? A strong man cuts his wrist. Without reform, the country has no future. Once the reforms are made, the people will have no way out. To untie this knot, we must return power to the people. 30 years ago, the reform was launched, and the people were elated and devoted themselves to the reform. 30 years later, when we talk about reform, the majority of the people talk about reform, and their faces change, and they are frightened. There is only one reason, that is, something went wrong with the reform. I think the problem mainly has the following points. 1. Decision-making is always designed at the top level, and the opinions of the people are basically not listened to. The top leaders of every reform always like to rely on the desire of powerful experts and elites, and seldom or basically do not solicit opinions and suggestions from the people. There are some laws and regulations that can openly solicit the opinions of the people, but the reform measures have never publicly solicited the opinions of the people. It often results in what the upper class wants to change instead of what the people want. It is divorced from the masses, scratching at the itch, and even runs counter to public opinion. 2nd, the reform always requires the common people to pay more, so that some units and individuals can make a lot of money. Housing, education, medicine, water, electricity, gas, etc. Which is not to ask the common people to pay more for every reform. In particular, almost all hearings are price increase meetings. It has become a clear rule to increase the price as soon as the hearing is heard. 3 workers were laid off due to enterprise reform. No official has ever been laid off. In particular, the change from public to private has led to the layoff of millions of workers, leaving them to fend for themselves. So far, no one cares about laid-off workers across the country. The fact is that the iron rice bowl of the master, worker, was broken, but the golden rice bowl of the public servant was created. The fish-water relationship of the dry group is changed to an oil-water relationship. 4th, reform income distribution and create gaps in Guinness. Workers' salary reform has not been increased for 20 years, and a minimum standard has been stipulated for the next 10 years. Retired workers call for an increase of 100 a year, but officials keep silent but add 2,000 to 5,000. 6,000 workers and peasants a year, and 66.7 million high officials a year. It became a global joke. 5. To reform social security, officials and ordinary people will go to heaven and earth. The common people's medical reform has become difficult and expensive to see a doctor, returning to poverty due to illness, and waiting to die without money. The official medical reform is reimbursed, and you can buy nutrition and daily necessities if you don't need it. For official car reform, 3,000 to 5,000 per month will be collected. Every time the common people change, everything has to be paid by themselves. 6. The price reform, the higher the reform. People's income and CPI growth have been a race between the tortoise and the hare. Housing prices have increased by 10 times in 10 years, and living expenses in 30 years. 10 yuan per person can be used for 1 month, which is not enough for 1 meal now. How could the people not be frightened? 7. With the reform of the civil service system, corruption among officials has intensified. Mistresses and mistresses have become the patent of corrupt officials, and corruption is no longer tens of thousands but tens of thousands, 10,000 square meters, 1,000 cubic meters. 8. Institutional reform, the proportion of government and people and the consumption of public services are the first in the world. There are dozens of department leaders and deputy officials, more than 100 administrative agencies in a county, and more than 1,000 public institutions. A company will be supervised by 17 or 8 flat caps, management agencies, asking for money and fined if they keep silent. Reception, eating and drinking, a guest house at the county level is more than 10 million every year. There are more than 2,500 counties in the country, how many provinces, prefectures, and cities, and seafood restaurants in guest houses, hotels, and hotels are overwhelming, and the consumption of sangong is unprecedented. 9. Market reforms are becoming more and more chaotic, and life safety is not guaranteed. Fake and shoddy products, cheating and abduction abound. In particular, the problems of air, land, water, food, and medicine are very serious, and there are many hidden dangers in houses and cars. It caused the people to live in panic. 10. Pension reform, the elderly cannot afford to be ill or live. If you are alive, your children and society cannot be relied on, especially if you are sick. You can jump on your feet. If you die, you can't afford a cemetery. Therefore, 30 years of reform and opening up is not perfect, full of successes and brilliant achievements. A rogue-style reform is an act of a beast.